RBC model, or again, an aggregate macro model that's going to feature equilibrium employment and endogenous participation in the labor market, mostly because that's going to allow us to also understand to what extent carbon taxes are affecting the extensive margin of labor supply. And we're going to follow the literature when it comes to thinking about how we introduce pollution or these damages from CO2 emissions via pollution externality. In these types of models, if you're not familiar with them, oftentimes what we end up assuming is that you have these emissions, you have a carbon tax, and then firms can basically abate some of the emissions that they generate, which is costly, right? So it's sort of investing in mechanisms that allow you to basically reduce the contribution of your output to emissions. The key contribution here is really thinking about an environment where you not only have a notion of firm entry, so basically it's costly for you to create a firm, but once you enter, you get to choose which technology you use to produce. You can use a regular technology that's effectively polluting or generating emissions, or you can think about adopting a green technology that effectively doesn't pollute. And the benefits of adopting this green technology are twofold. The first one is that obviously you don't have to pay a carbon tax if you're not generating emissions, and you don't have to face any abatement costs, but there's a fixed cost associated with adopting that green technology. Okay, I'll give you some examples about what we mean by green technology in a second. What's really nice about this setup is that by having both firm entry and this technology adoption margin, you end up having an endogenous technological composition structure of production. And that's going to be key for some of the results that I'm going to be showing you later on. And I'll be clear about what this endogenous technology composition implies. Having set up that model, what we do is calibrate the model to match key features of the US labor market and the US economy, thinking about effectively what the regular sector is and what the green sector is. And then we quantitatively analyze what happens when you introduce a carbon tax that effectively reduces emissions to meet the target that the Biden administration has set by 2030. Okay. All right, so what is different compared to what we know from existing models? There's been, since roughly 2012, a lot of growth and a lot of work trying to understand what happens with carbon taxes at the aggregate level from a macro standpoint. Existing macro models that use, again, versions like the model that we're going to be using, except in a reduced form, tend to either assume that there's one sector and a typical firm that basically adjusts via abatement costs to deal with basically the carbon tax. The same model can be expanded to allow for simply just firm entry and exit, but you still have one sector that ends up generating pollution. Then you have versions that have effectively two sectors. Think about a dirty sector and a clean sector. And the dirty sector or the dirty firm ends up adjusting to carbon taxes via abatement. And then you have versions of these models with equilibrium unemployment. The general conclusion from all of these models is that whenever you introduce a carbon tax, you end up reducing emissions, which is something that, again, you would expect, but you also end up having adverse effects on GDP and broadly defined labor, whether it's employment or labor. And again, there are several papers that have found this. What's difficult about these models is that it's really at odds with what we know from, again, the work that Gib and Jim have done and others regarding from an empirical standpoint, what are the aggregate effects and the employment effects of a carbon tax.
Sorry, Alan.
Yeah.
Can I make you a question about this point?
Yes, of course.
Isn't there a recent paper on the CPR by Conrad and Weber Di Maro? I think she suggests that in Canada and Europe, the carbon taxes cause the deflation, right? And therefore, she interprets the effect of the carbon taxes is so big on economic activity that instead of causing inflation, it actually depresses prices. So I was wondering how that is consistent with your work and your model.
So you can take a look at what happens to prices depending on the category of firm. We haven't really paid that much attention to that because obviously you can think about issues related to what extent carbon taxes are going to have an impact on inflation. I don't know if I have an answer to your question, given the model that we have. We have flexible prices. You can obviously introduce sticky prices and be able to say something about the transition path of inflation once you introduce the carbon tax. But that would imply basically having a sticky price model. I didn't know about that paper, but that's something that obviously we're going to be continuing to work on this issue, and obviously from a central bank standpoint, this is something that matters a lot. Yeah, thank you. Okay. If there are any other questions, so the reason why we moved to this setup where we think about green technology adoption is because based on the papers that we've seen so far, there are different margins that might potentially matter when it comes to thinking about the labor market and aggregate effects of carbon taxes that are missing in these papers. One of them is, again, the fact that whenever you introduce a carbon tax, firms can not only say, okay, I'm going to pay for sequestration or whatever, keep the same technology that I'm using to produce, but simply just cover the costs that imply dealing with whatever CO2 emissions I'm generating. Oftentimes what firms end up doing is saying, well, I'm going to simply change the technology that I used to produce. I'm going to use solar panels. I'm going to use, wind, energy generated by wind. And that's something that's missing in current setups. The second margin is really thinking about firm entry and exit. That oftentimes when you think about a carbon tax, that effectively ends up increasing the cost of operating as a firm. And that could potentially depress firm entry and therefore have adverse effects on GDP. And you want to be able to account for both. The final margin is something that the literature hasn't really explored that much, and it's whether you actually end up affecting the extensive margin of participation. And again, just this is a graph that Gabe likes to show when he presents this. But again, the way to think about the different margins that you can use to reduce emissions, you can change the way you consume, right? You can abate emissions, meaning that you use the same technology to produce, but you're basically paying for, again, in the scenario, think about carbon sequestration. You can adjust what technologies you use when you enter the market. And you can fundamentally change, again, how you produce as an existing firm. So thinking about switching, if Amazon switches from using regular vans to deliver goods and switches to basically, electric vehicles, that's basically a margin of adjustment that hasn't really been explored in these types of models. Okay. So what are the findings? Yep.
Hi, Juan Guerra Salas here from the bank.
Hey, Juan.
Just a clarifying question.
Yep.
That's because I'm not familiar with this literature. So you're studying a carbon tax for the US as a way to simplify the measures that the US government would take to reduce emissions to meet the targets. Because as I understand, it's politically impossible that the US will implement a carbon tax, right? They'll do this by regulation and other tools. But so I guess the carbon tax is just a simple way to model the measures that the government would take, right?
So you can think about, at least within the context of these models, a carbon tax or basically a trading scheme for emissions ends up having basically similar effects. Forgetting about business cycle dynamics, we know that carbon taxes end up generating a little bit more volatility compared to sort of a trading scheme. But going back to your initial point, there are a lot of bills in Congress right now that actually are talking about a carbon tax. So it's not as politically, it seems to be more politically feasible, especially now that carbon taxes are getting traction not only in other countries but also here in the U.S. And this comes, it's bipartisan in the sense that it's not only Democrats that are pushing for a carbon tax. Republicans are also open to this. Obviously, you still have a lot of challenges, but it's something that, from a implementability standpoint, it seems to be the easiest thing to do.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah. And again, this is coming from my knowledge about this, which Gib is the expert on carbon taxes, not me. Okay. So in terms of findings and main contributions, one of the really interesting things that we find here is that once we allow for this idea that as a firm, when you enter, you get to choose which technology you use to produce, carbon taxes end up having positive both short-term and long-term effects on output and consumption. Which again stands at odds with what you find in models that abstract from these margins. You get positive effects on participation in the labor market and very limited adverse effects on unemployment. So you don't see these sort of costs taking place because of the implementation of a carbon tax. And the key mechanism behind this, and I have a sort of a nice table that we generated a couple of weeks ago that shows this very clearly, is that it really goes back to how the carbon tax is changing the overall production structure that you use in the economy in terms of what technologies you use to produce. So in all of these discussions, especially in policy circles, about the transition to a lower carbon, cleaner economy, what we have in mind is really thinking about the fundamental way in which we produce. And this model allows you to capture that endogenous transition that will happen as a result of policies that you implement to deal with carbon emissions. Again, these findings stand in contrast with what we know from existing macro models that generally tend to ignore this idea of or this margin of being able to as a firm choose to use a green technology, but are again consistent or often a way to rationalize why is it that in empirical studies, again you can think about British Columbia, but also for Europe, that you have positive employment and GDP effects from carbon taxes. And again, obviously, this is going to depend on how you calibrate the model, but at least for the US, you actually do see these positive effects. Okay, so if there aren't any questions, let me go over the model. And given that I have roughly an hour or so, what I'm going to do is give you the overall structure of the model. I'm happy to show you some of the details of the model if you have any questions, but I think it makes more sense to spend more time on sort of the results because these are results that are a bit unexpected given what we know about carbon taxes. But again, I'm happy to go over any details about the model that you might have. So in terms of the model structure, you can think about an RBC economy, essentially. We're going to forget about stochastic shocks, but it's still going to be a basic structure that we all know, where the economy is comprised of firms and a representative household. The way we're going to think about firm entry is by following Bilby-Giorni and Mellitz, whereby firms end up facing a sunk entry cost to basically enter. In terms of the labor market, we're going to have a standard search and matching environment that leads to a clear unemployment with, again, this twist of allowing households to basically decide whether they participate in the labor market or not. This is useful because it allows you to really think about how is it that in response to carbon taxes, households end up changing their search behavior for employment. And I'll show you, how the behavior of unemployment actually stems from this behavior of search from the household side. Now, within the context of firms can choose which production technology they end up using once they enter the market. So they can use this regular or polluting technology that basically generates as a byproduct of producing, you end up generating emissions. That's the standard in which we, this is modeled in macro models. Now using this technology, you face a carbon tax, and you can also abate some of the emissions that you generate, but that's costly. And the more you abate, the costlier it becomes. At the same time, once you enter, depending on your productivity, you might decide to say, hey, I'm not going to end up using energy from coal plants. I'm going to end up using solar panels. Right? And that's going to imply that you're choosing this green or non-polluting technology that implies that you are able to circumvent the carbon tax. But obviously, in order to be able to adopt that technology, you basically face a fixed cost to adopt this technology, which you pay each and every period as long as you use the technology. So it's almost like renting. If you want to rent an electric vehicle to deliver your goods as a firm, that entails a sort of a rental cost that is paid each period. There are different ways in which you can model pollution externalities. You can think about how pollution ends up affecting the utility of the household. That's an equivalent way of doing this by effectively saying that pollution ends up affecting the productivity of firms. So effectively, it's almost like a TFP shifter that firms take as given. So whenever you have more pollution, you end up being less productive, and you take that as given as a firm. And again, as I mentioned, there's this margin of participation in the labor market that households end up being in charge of. This setup, excluding this carbon tax and green technology, is actually rooted in some work that I have with Federico Mandelman that looks at technology adoption in digital markets. But it's basically built on that setup where you get to choose which technology you use in a very tractable environment.
Adam?
Yeah.
May I ask a question? I don't know if you're going to explain it later, but in terms of cost of regular and green firms, you don't consider they have like a variable cost difference? Why?
In the
or
sense
you're going to
of,
explain it later?
So in the sense of adopting the technology?
No, in the sense of using the technology. I mean, paying for, I don't know, produce using gas or coal is going to be different variable cost than using solar panels.
Yes. So within the structure of
Sorry about
firms.
that. So let me interrupt 1 second. I am Ernesto Paston from the bank.
I
I have a related question.
Yep.
Is whether when there is a switch in technology,
Yep.
is there a different draw in different got access to a different draw in productivity?
So once, maybe let me answer this question, I think in the following slide, where what you have to do is when you enter the market, you draw your productivity from a given distribution, and that draw basically, remains the same until you end up exiting for exogenous reasons. And based on that draw, you end up choosing which technology you use. So that draw in turn is going to determine effectively which technology you end up using, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
It answered mine. I'm not sure Mario's.
Okay. So
yeah, I think it's like a different way to approach it, but yeah, basically what you're saying is that green and polluting firms are going to have different productivity.
Yes, and the average
Yeah.
productivity that you have is going to be endogenous. So it's not
Yeah,
something that we
okay.
end up assuming, hey, you end up having a given productivity just because you adopt this technology. That's going to be basically, it's going to be affected by policy in an endogenous way. Now, going back to Mario, going back to your question about variable costs, you end up using labor and capital. So the marginal cost that regular firms have and that green firms have is going to be both endogenous and it's going to be different as well. Because in fact, one of the components that ends up affecting the marginal cost of regular firms is actually the carbon tax. That when you increase the carbon tax, you end up making it more expensive for firms to produce, and that ends up affecting the marginal cost.
Sorry
Okay.
for
No, that
insisting
works.
on this, but I think this is key for understanding the mechanism. So the productivity draw of the firm is like a fixed effect for the firm, and then there is a selection going on which firms switch to the green technology or not.
Exactly.
It's not a new draw. So in that sense, the profile of marginal cost is the same for both types of firms once you abstract from the decisions of the firm.
So you're talking about about heterogeneity within a given group. That's what you have in mind, or no?
I'm asking about whether the new, which is I think is Mario's question, is whether the new draw. I'm sorry, whether when the firm switches to green technology, whether anything changed for the firm. And I think the answer is no, because the profile, I mean, switching implies some endogenous decision that end up affecting marginal cost.
Correct.
But the firm from the very beginning has the options. All the options are basically open to the
Correct.
firm.
Yes. Yeah.
It's pure selection.
Yes. Yeah. And again, within effectively the way we're going to solve this model is you're going to assume that there's an average productivity for the green firm and an average productivity for the regular firm. So in a sense, if you think about, if you know the Gironi-Melitz environment, when you think about it, you enter and then you decide to produce domestically or to export, it's basically an adaptation of that model, except that instead of thinking about exporter versus non-exporters, you think about regular versus green, if that makes sense. Okay. So in terms of the production structure, and again, we're going to have an endogenous measure NT of firms, and they face this sunk cost phi E that's obviously positive in order to be able to enter. So once they enter, then they draw this idiosyncratic productivity A from a given distribution, and that's when they get to choose which technology they end up using to produce. Again, there are two production technologies that are available that use both capital and labor. The regular technology that, again, we have subscripts R for regular, that end up generating emissions. And this term DXT is basically the pollution damages, where XT is the stock of pollution in the economy. So whenever the stock of pollution goes up, all else equal, even if you have the same inputs, that's going to end up reducing your how much you're able to produce. This damages function ends up affecting both regular and green firms. So even if you're using solar panels to produce, the fact that you might have other firms producing and generating emissions is also going to have an impact on you, because again, emissions have sort of an aggregate effect. Yeah.
Sorry, Gonzalo Garcia here.
Hey, Gonzalo.
Hi, Alan. I have A question related to the damage function, because we usually think about the damages of the CO2 accumulation as a global issue, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
maybe United States is a big country, so you could think that if United States change the amount of CO2 emissions, something is going to happen at the global level, but still it's not so direct. It's like if the United States change a little the level of pollution, we shouldn't see much changes in terms of the effects of coming from the global warming on the production functions at the firm level. I think it's, I don't know.
Yes, so this is a really good point. The way we think about this pollution stock XT is not only going to be a function of the emissions that you end up generating as within sort of the US economy, but there's also a term that for now we keep constant that basically will be emissions from the rest of the world. So it is true that there's this concern about leakages, right? That potentially one of the things that can happen is obviously that if other countries keep doing the same thing, the US is going to be affected by an increase in global emissions, right? And at the same time, we're not allowing, or we're not saying anything about how a reduction in emissions in the US economy is going to have an impact on the rest of the world, simply because we're keeping, again, emissions from the rest of the world fixed. There's a lot of concern about the fact that, you know, if you introduce a carbon tax, what ends up happening is that the US ends up shifting production abroad, right? Production of you know, using technologies that end up polluting. Let's say they send production to Mexico, and Mexico is not great at you know, using clean technologies, and that ends up basically affecting the overall stock of pollution in the economy. That's something that in a reduced form you can capture by basically saying that whenever you end up reducing emissions in the US, potentially emissions in the rest of the world end up increasing slightly because of these leakages effects. That doesn't really end up affecting the main results that we have. If you want to do this seriously, then you need the two region or two country model to be able to capture this idea of leakages for sure. Yeah. Okay.
Alan?
Yes.
In that sense, I don't know what's the structure of that, but some pollution is gonna be they're gonna be diluted, like the air pollution, but others gonna be local, like the water pollution.
Correct. Yeah.
Does that carbon tax is gonna apply only to air, or is gonna apply to a broader sense of
so
like
that's an
pollution,
excellent question.
and that could apply better to the damage function that you're talking here?
That's an excellent question. So in this scenario, given the fact that we have this broad notion of basically two sectors, we basically lump all of the sectors that are mostly responsible for CO2 emissions. We lump them into the regular sector, and then the rest are going to be in the green sector. So we're not able to differentiate between, you know, whether the pollution is affecting, you know, is translated to water pollution or air pollution. We simply say these are CO2 emissions, and we're not able to say anything about whether it would be, you know, in different categories. And again, that's, I think, one of the limitations of working with a macro model. It's as long as, you know, you end up affecting the way you produce or the utility of the household, that's basically all that matters within this environment.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Now, again, as I said earlier, emissions are going to be a function of basically how you end up producing in the regular sector, where parameter new is going to be capturing the elasticity with which, you know, if you have an increase in the production by regular firms, to what extent that translates into emissions. And mu t is the abatement rate that regular firms end up choosing, you know, whenever they face a carbon tax. If the carbon tax is zero, then the optimal abatement rate is zero. You don't need to abate emissions because you don't face a cost, right? And again, I want to emphasize that even if you know, you can model this as just a productivity shifter. If you, instead of model pollution as affecting adversely, you know, the utility of households, you end up getting basically the same overall results. This is just the way most of the literature does it. Now, thinking about the technology choice, again, firms with a productivity, with an idiosyncratic productivity level that's below a threshold AG, where this threshold is endogenous, are going to end up adopting the regular technology. So they basically do business as usual, but they have to face a carbon tax on whatever emissions they end up generating. And if they want to abate emissions, they face this total cost that's a function of how much you end up producing. And it's convex in the abatement rate, right? So you're never going to be in a world where you're abating 100% of whatever emissions you're generating. It's always going to be between 0 and 100. But that's again a margin that people consider within these models when it comes to thinking about carbon taxes and how they affect firms. So if you were only to think about a firm that can only use the regular technology and the only instrument to deal with a carbon tax is to use abatement, then you end up getting the standard result that if you introduce a carbon tax, it's more costly for firms to operate, and then you end up basically seeing a reduction in economic activity and a reduction in employment, which again is what we know from standard models. Where we come in is again where you have this option to adopt a green technology. So if your productivity level is above this endogenous threshold, you end up adopting the green technology. You don't face a carbon tax. You don't have to pay abatement costs, but you have to incur this fixed cost per period Fiji, right? Here, it's just basically constant. You can make it a function of the marginal cost of firms. You can make it increasing or decreasing in basically the number of green firms that you have in the economy. That doesn't really change the results. It's just easier to think about this as in the sense that you have like an iceberg cost. But again, our results are not sensitive to assuming that this cost is variable.
Alan?
Yeah.
Hi, Benjamin.
Hi, Benjamin.
One question regarding technology.
Yeah.
Have you thought that, I'm not that into the subject, but what I've heard in usually the opposition a lot has to do with new technology being maybe like more automated, more capital intensive, or more like a high skill intensive, and like people don't want to. A lot of jobs in the oil industry are probably low, so that is probably the biggest cost that people saw in the discussion, and I don't know if you thought about including it, and if you think that will change at least the short-term impact, like while the economy adjusts and the education adjusts.
So that's a very good question. The way we're thinking about this, and we think that this is the most conservative approach, is you have basically, when you think about the labor market, each of these firms has to post different vacancies. So it's as if you want to adopt the green technology, you're actually going to have to go to a different, quote unquote, different labor market, meaning that that you need to hire basically another set of workers. This would be capturing effectively the fact that whenever you want to switch from the regular technology to the green technology, you might have these skill adjustments that you need to go through that are potentially costly, and that's going to be reflected on the household side when you think about the household deciding to send individuals from to search in one sector versus the other. That's not imperfectly. These are not perfect substitutes. There's a differential utility cost from searching that effectively is capturing in a reduced form way the fact that potentially if you move to the green sector, installing, working in a mine or in an oil field is going to entail different skills than, for example, installing solar panels, right? So those are the types of things that in a reduced form way would be captured by the choice that a household has when it comes to sending individuals to one labor market or the other. And that again, that's as a benchmark. Going back to this idea of using different capital, you could make this a function of whatever capital the green firm is using, and again, you would still obtain the same conclusions that we have in the paper, if that makes sense.
But I mean, that will be just in welfare, it will always be better, or maybe more capital intensive will be bigger for the capital owners and not for the workers or labor shares and stuff like that.
That's an excellent question. We don't say anything explicitly about welfare, because I think what you have in mind is effectively that's one set of households or one set of firm owners are going to benefit and the others are going to suffer. We have a representative household. I don't know what would happen if you end up separating, let's say, firm owners from households. And we assume basically perfect risk pooling within the household, that even though you might have a reduction in employment in one sector, and sort of an increase in the other sector, everyone ends up consuming the same amount. From a welfare standpoint, since we have an increase in consumption, that ends up dominating whatever happens to participation. So you would get, if you wanted to say something about welfare, you would get welfare gains from the carbon tax because of the increase in consumption. But obviously, if you want to take your question seriously, you really need to separate households and firms, and then also separate households into two categories, right? You might think about households that are in the middle of the country that would be adversely affected by a carbon tax if people work in mines versus people who work in San Francisco, right? But that entails having more heterogeneity within the context of the household, and which is something that we abstract from.
I guess you can always like put subsidies and taxes to different parts and get to the kind of like the optimal. Just hearing that from the usual discussion, like political discussion, that seems to be like an important.
Absolutely, yes. The way we think about the carbon tax revenue is basically as being sent lump sum to the household. So you can think about these types of transfers as potentially offsetting some of the adverse effects that some individual households might be facing because of the carbon tax. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep. So within this context, again, what's really important is that you end up getting these endogenous measures of firms in each category that are going to be, a function of basically this endogenous threshold productivity level above which you end up using the green technology. More broadly, what you end up getting is, again, this endogenous production structure that, depending on the policies that you have in place, you basically shift in the production from one set of firms to the other. And obviously, the set of firms is potentially, increasing or shrinking. And I think that's really important when it comes to thinking about the average productivity composition of the economy. So just being a little bit mindful of time. If anyone wants to see some of the details of the model, I'm happy to show them to you. But again, this is basically the core of the model, because it really tells you basically what are the key elements. One of them being how average productivity is going to be determined within the context of the model, and then basically what that entails for the measures of firms in each category. From the perspective of households and sort of thinking about market clearing more generally, again, households are going to derive utility from consumption, and they're going to suffer if they end up participating in the labor market. Again, sort of the standard assumption in these models. And they receive labor income from working in each category of firms, and also income from owning firms. And again, sort of the standard represented environment that where the household ends up owning all firms. So again, I mean, if you want to separate these, you could do it. We haven't tried doing that in the model, but you can. Households as a baseline are going to be receiving this carbon tax revenue as a lump sum transfer. You can think about, for example, using the revenue to cut on, if you have payroll taxes, you can also cut payroll taxes. You can use the revenue to subsidize green technology adoption. All of these things end up basically generating the same results for us. In fact, if you end up using the revenue to further subsidize green technology adoption, the results are even better from a quantitative standpoint. But the overall conclusions don't change, regardless of, again, the way you use the revenue. Households end up making these decisions over firm creation. So think about this as a notion of investment, but just in firms instead of on physical capital. And again, they end up making these decisions over participation, where they end up deciding where to send searchers. Whether they want to search for a regular job or a job with a green firm. In terms of closing the model, we have standard Nash bargaining, just again following the literature, and then obviously market clearing in each of the categories of production. Okay. If there are any questions, again, I'm happy to go over details of the model, but I think the results are obviously more interesting, and that's where I want to spend a little bit more time dissecting the mechanism that we have in the model.
Alan, I just have a clarifying question from you said the firms. I just kept thinking about something that Mario said. When you choose to go for the abatement technology, there is 100% of abatement, right? There is no like partial reduction in emissions. It's either you.
So meaning no, you can. So you choose mu, and it's sort of a continuous. It's between 0 and 1, right? And that's something that you end up choosing. Yeah. So it's sort of the intensity. You think about capital utilization. It's the same idea, but just in terms of reducing the impact of production and emissions.
Yeah, my bad. So it's endogenous. Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's a choice that the firm makes for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of the quantitative analysis, we have a baseline economy that has a zero carbon tax because at least in the U.S. there's no nationwide carbon tax. It is true that some states like California and I think Massachusetts have sort of ways in which they have these trading schemes, but at the national level we simply don't have a carbon tax. Obviously, there are some parameters that are important when it comes to thinking about the emission side, and here we basically adopt the parameters that people have used in the literature. So there's a very famous study by Norhaus that basically estimates the elasticity of abatement with respect to the output that's produced by firms. So we take that parameter from the literature and the elasticity of with respect to emissions. That also comes from Garth Hoytel is the one who actually started this sort of macro literature on thinking about emissions and carbon taxes. There are key calibration targets that we end up adopting that are specific to the US. One of them is thinking about the pollution damages function, whereby we calibrate damages from pollution to be roughly 0.69% of GDP, which is consistent with what people have estimated for the US. And then this is where things become a little bit, you have to take a stand when it comes to what are green firms and what are regular firms. Here we follow work by Hafstad and Williams, whereby they end up basically assuming that the regular sector is effectively sectors that end up contributing the most to carbon emissions. So this would be agriculture, mining, utilities, transport, construction, chemicals, manufacturing in different forms. And we take basically an average for the US. In the context of Chile, for example, most of the CO2 emissions, based on what I've read, come from manufacturing and also just electricity generation. So in this scenario, the share of output that comes from regular firms is roughly 20% of based on BA data, and the share of employment in total employment is roughly 16.5% per BLS data. So again, green firms will be all of the firms, all of the activity that comes from not from these sectors, but whatever remaining sectors you might have. So a lot of services and these types of things. Now, does that mean that those sectors don't generate emissions? They might generate emissions indirectly, but these are the main culprits, at least in the literature. So again, this is something that is always controversial when we present this paper, but you have to take a stand when it comes to how you divide the economy. Now, having calibrated the model to these targets, and again, others, what we end up doing is we increase this carbon tax to generate a 35% reduction in emissions in the long run. And again, this is roughly consistent with the commitments that the Biden administration has made. So if you take a look at, we're in 2020, we've seen a reduction in emissions, and what remains to be done from now on until 2030, which is again the target for the Biden administration, is roughly a 35% reduction in emissions. So that's why which was 35. Okay. Now, in terms of the results, let me show you a couple of tables that focus on the steady state, and then I'll show you what the transitional dynamics look like, and then I'll spend some time talking about the economic intuition behind the mechanisms. So in terms of the main results, this is really looking at basically select variables of the model, and then what the percent change is relative to the baseline no tax world, and basically for variables that are in rates, the percentage point change. So the key results here is that you end up getting, for a 35% reduction in emissions, you end up getting output and consumption that are increasing, marginally, but they're still increasing, and I think this is relevant. So total output increased by roughly 0.3%, consumption increased by roughly 0.2%. There's obviously a large adjustment, downward adjustment for employment in the sectors that end up, or the set of firms that end up generating emissions, and there's an increase in employment by basically green firms. Total employment ends up increasing marginally. Real wages don't really change that much. And what's really interesting here is that even though total output is increasing, there's actually a reduction in the number of firms in the economy. So what's really happening here is that the tax ends up disincentivizing entry by firms, but then there's a change in the composition of production in the economy such that you actually end up seeing an overall increase in output, which again is important because you want to account for both margins. One is thinking about how policies is disincentivizing entry in the first place, and then how overall production from existing firms ends up shifting. There's a natural increase in the number of firms that are green, quote unquote, just because, you know, by increasing the carbon tax, you're making it more expensive for you as a regular firm to produce, and then firms end up basically at the margin adopting the green technology, solar panels, wind, etc.
Alan?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So,
yep.
The change in the composition that you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
implies that you have firms going from the dirty sector to the clean sector, right?
Correct, yes.
And in terms of, if you're thinking, for instance, in a framework, in a multi-sector model,
yep.
that would mean that you are seeing a huge change in the productive structure of the economy, right? You are seeing a lot of firms going from the electricity generation sector, from the transport sector, from the manufacturing sector to, I don't know, service sectors, which are much cleaner in their production function, right?
So if you were to really think about having a model that has all of the different sectors, or like the 20 sectors that we have in a given economy, yes, in the context of this model, it's more about not necessarily thinking about specific sectors, but it's more about how, you know, you could still remain in manufacturing, but instead of using electricity from coal plants, you end up using basically wind farms or solar. So we're not really taking a stand in terms of how specific sectors are changing, but it's more about the underlying production technology that you use. So you might remain in the same sector, but you're just using a different technology. And again, that's sort of a limitation of not having, you know, a truly multi-sector model. But we think that this is a good baseline, and then we can build from there.
Thanks.
Alan?
Yeah.
Sorry, this is Ernesto. Could you explain how total employment may go up when employment for the polluting industry firms is going down so much?
Yeah, so this is really about the base effects. That remember that our employment is 16% of total employment. So if you were to look at absolute levels, basically you end up seeing, you know, G employment doesn't, in percent terms, doesn't really increase by much because it's already pretty high.
But the baseline is zero carbon tax, no?
Correct. Yeah.
So that doesn't mean that what you call green is already a big chunk of the firms in the economy.
It is a big chunk, but again, there's a difference between the measure of firms that you have in the green sector and the amount of employment of total employment that you have in the green sector. So this is, again, from a percent standpoint, it's not very large, but you're going from roughly, again, what is it? 85% of total employment, and then you end up increasing that by, again, 4.8%. So again, it has to do with the base level of employment that you have in those two sectors. Yeah.
That's exactly what I don't understand very well. So what are forget about the carbon tax for a second.
Yeah.
What are the implications of the model regarding the structure of the economy in terms of the firm size, and in terms of which firms are the ones that have the green technology or the polluted technology?
So
carbon tax.
Yeah, so in terms of firm size, we haven't really looked at what the average firm size would be of, let's say, green firms versus regular firms. That's something that we can take a look at. We haven't really paid that much attention to that.
Because it seems to me, I mean, I may be wrong, but it seems to me that even without the carbon tax, this is a pretty clean world. It's a world where a lot of the employment is going on in firms that have the green technology.
That's
without
correct. Yes, that's correct. Yeah, for sure. But again, that's because of the mapping that we end up adopting, where if you really think about, you know, most of the employment, let's say in the US, is in services, which doesn't necessarily, services is not the biggest contributor to CO2 emissions, right? So this is really about this argument of thinking about, you know, you close a mine that ends up polluting a lot, but the share of employment that you have in that mine is pretty small. So I think that speaks to your point. Even though you already have a large amount of employment in what would be a non-polluting sector, you still care about what might happen in the other sector, right? If you end up killing manufacturing jobs, from a political standpoint at least. But from an aggregate standpoint, this is what's happening given the allocation of employment that we have in the model.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Now, from the perspective of the unemployment rate, the participation rate, again, this is you have an unemployment that's on average 6% before the tax, and it increases to 6.05%. So again, given the reduction in emissions, it's not that big of an increase in unemployment. There's more participation, and that comes mostly from people actually searching for jobs in the green sector. So this reallocation of employment. The abatement rate increases from roughly 0% to 25, roughly 25%. So I think, Miguel, going back to your point again, this is basically continuous, right? And finally, in terms of the tax revenue output ratio, it goes from obviously 0% with a zero tax to 0.2% of GDP.
Alan?
Yes.
Just a quick question, just to understand if I'm getting it right. So
yep.
The emissions are reduced in 35%, right? You run your exercise to match that.
Yeah.
To get that. So that implies an increase in TFP of how much?
So you're thinking about the average productivity. So thinking about the average productivity differentials.
Yeah, because you said there's an externality. I want to get how much of this comes because you get that.
So meaning that. So right. So thinking about this dx thing
exactly,
that if x falls, actually this is pretty. It's very tiny. I don't have the number in my head, but it's very tiny. So these effects on output are actually not coming from the fact that the damages end up reducing. Why? Because when you think about estimating the pollution stock as a function of previous pollution and then emissions, this is highly persistent. You know, reducing emissions right now is going to have a tiny effect on the stock of pollution. So the effects are not coming from the fact that now, because you reduce emissions, that's going to reduce the pollution stock, simply because the pollution stock is extremely persistent. So the effects really come from how you're changing the production technologies. So really thinking about moving from using coal to moving to using, let's say, wind and solar as, you know, simple examples, if that makes sense. Yeah, but that's a good question. Okay. So now let's think about eliminating some of the mechanisms that we introduced relative to previous papers. Okay, so the first one is, so this is just a summary I've already said. Again, positive effects on output, consumption, marginal on wages, even as the number of firms ends up in the economy ends up, falling. And again, this is sort of an output composition effect that we see in the data. Sorry, in the model. Now, what happens if you say, okay, I'm going to eliminate the fact that firms can enter and exit, but you still allow firms to decide effectively what technology to adopt, right? So you're basically shutting down firm entry, but you still have this technology adoption margin. Here, what I want to emphasize is that the positive effects end up being greater, and that makes sense because you don't see this overall reduction in the number of firms, and therefore in the overall, productive capacity of the economy from a firm standpoint, right? So that's why we think that having the two margins ends up giving you a more realistic perspective of what would happen from an output standpoint. And it really highlights the fact that this composition effect from moving from one technology to the other, and something that I'll emphasize in a few slides with a nice table, explains these positive effects from the carbon tax. Obviously, if you have these larger effects on output and consumption, the effects on unemployment are actually the adverse effects on unemployment are even smaller. Right? Okay. Now, let's now forget about technology adoption and firm entry, right? So you still have two sectors, dirty and clean, but you don't get to decide whether you actually can switch in response to policy, right? So in this scenario, this is this last column, you actually end up seeing adverse effects on output and consumption and adverse effects on income or wages in this scenario that are consistent with basically the standard models that don't take into account this technology adoption decision that firms can make, that we think is a relevant adjustment margin when we think about firms adjusting to policy. So again, here we're basically replicating. There are other papers that look at similar reductions in emissions via carbon tax, and we end up getting very similar effects from output and consumption. So again, in this world, that's sort of the world that we know up to the paper, you end up seeing adverse effects from carbon taxes. Once you start to think about this fact that you can choose different technologies in response to policy, then you start to see positive effects on output, or at least no damages from an output standpoint. Notice again that given that you have this reduction in output and consumption, you also have a larger increase in unemployment. It's not that large, but it's still larger than what we see when we think about firms' ability to be able to adopt green technologies. Yeah.
So I think if you think in the framework from Acemoglu et al. 2012 or 2016,
yes.
So I think here you are being a little more optimistic in the sense that so those papers state like a path dependence issue where and they say that carbon tax, but it's by itself is not going to change much the technology adoption by the firms without R&D subsidies, right? And because they say it's like the clean technology starts from a very, very bad point, a starting point. So if you don't help the firms with R&D subsidies, those firms by themselves are not going to be able to catch or to improve the clean technology in order to do the switch. So in here, you don't have that problem, right?
So this is a really good point. So the Acemoglu paper ends up not only accounting for the fact that firms can choose to use green technologies, but also that they have to spend resources trying to basically develop those green technologies. Our approach is really not about R&D. It's saying, look, we already have some technologies that are green, solar, wind, etc. What happens if you have access to those? Because this is something that obviously, when you think about this, it's just like, where is the R&D, right? We need to develop technologies that are going to allow us to be able to transition to a lower carbon economy. The reason why we don't take a look at an R&D specifically is because there's recent studies by the IMF suggesting that even with the current technologies, you can achieve significant reductions in emissions. It is true that in the Acemoglu world, what ends up happening is that there are resource costs associated with R&D, right? So you're going to have to trade off what will happen with, let's say, consumption, etc. In a way, that's captured here in the model because whenever you choose to incur this fixed cost of adopting the technology, you have to trade off consumption, right? At the margin. So there are trade-offs there, but we're not fully modeling R&D. The other thing about the paper that you mentioned is that, if I recall correctly, they also assume that you have R&D in the dirty sector, right? So you can basically become more efficient as a dirty producer. We don't have that in this world. Having said that, I don't know what their findings are regarding the adverse effects on output. I don't think they mention anything specific about whether this move towards a green technology ends up, or a clean world ends up having adverse effects on output. But maybe I might be just misremembering the paper.
Well,
but these are things,
yeah. I think without R&D subsidies, so the economy has to bear the increase in the prices of the goods produced intensively using the dirty technology, without much changing without much switching between to the green technology. So that has like a more adverse effect in terms of GDP and
So in this world, you do end up seeing, obviously, as you have a reduction in economic activity by regular firms, you end up seeing an increase in sort of their real price level, right? Which is something that you can compute. So in a sense, you are capturing this adverse effect that you might have by reducing economic activity in one sector, and in a way that's captured basically by the reduction in the number of firms. That effectively, if you care about competition, you basically have less competition in the economy. So those effects are potentially captured indirectly in the context of this model. But I take your point that this is sort of, I mean, I don't know if I would call it an optimistic approach, but it's sort of an environment where we take the status quo, we have these technologies. What happens if firms can adopt?
Alan, and what do you do with the taxes that you collect? You rebate them?
So the tax is basically a lump sum transfer to household as a baseline. We have experiments where you can use the tax to basically subsidize green technology adoption, which basically ends up generating even larger effects when it comes to total output and consumption. you can also use them to basically subsidize firm creation, right? So you can lower the costs of entry for firms, and you end up getting basically the same results that we get here from a qualitative standpoint. So things don't change that much how you end up using the revenue. Okay. So again, the summary here is that this technology adoption margin seems to be playing an important role. And one of the things that I want to do later on is dissect that mechanism a little bit more. Now, before I do that, let me just show you what happens from a transition standpoint, because obviously that's where search and matching frictions and the fact that it's costly to create firms comes in, right? So it might be the case that in the long run you end up seeing these positive effects, but it could be that the transition path is costly. So from that perspective, what we end up doing is, in order to determine whether you have short-term costs associated with a carbon tax, we consider a gradual uniform increase in the carbon tax that takes roughly 20 quarters to reach its long-run level. So you're not simply increasing the tax from 0 to, let's say, $60 per ton of CO2. You do it gradually over, let's say, 5 years, right? Again, you can play around with how aggressive you are. That doesn't really change the results. What matters is, to what extent is the path really differing depending on the model. Right. So in this scenario, again, we're comparing these three variants of the model: the benchmark, a model without firm entry but with technology adoption, and then we shut down both. The reduction in emissions, sort of almost by construction, is going to be effectively the same. But what you end up doing in order to generate the same increase in emission, the same reduction in emissions, the carbon tax that you need to do so when you don't allow firms to switch technologies is obviously going to be greater, right? So you need to increase the carbon tax by more compared to a world where firms can endogenously choose to basically move away from a polluting technology. And that in turn is reflected in basically the tax revenue GDP ratio, where that ratio is going to be increasing, partly because of the taxes increasing, but also because GDP is falling in this scenario. So that's actually one interesting point about the paper, that perhaps the tax that we need to reduce emissions, it doesn't have to be that large if firms are able to basically adopt technologies. That potentially is an issue, for example, for developing countries, because a lot of the technologies that are clean are oftentimes imported, right? And that can imply that then the barriers to green technology adoption can be greater for emerging and developing countries relative to advanced economies, where that's where a lot of the technologies are being developed or are already in place. So that's something again to keep in mind. Yep.
Quickly, one question: why is that the carbon tax has to be smaller when there is no entry related to the benchmark?
So part of that is the effect in terms of how you think about, if I recall correctly, when you have models with endogenous firm entry, you have to think about the welfare relevant way of measuring the price level versus what will be in the data when you don't have these sort of love of variety effects. So I think that has to do with the fact that when you have endogenous firm entry, and you might want to make these prices and quantities comparable to the data, you need this adjustment to basically extract the variety effect, and that's why you end up seeing a smaller increase in the tax. More broadly, in this scenario, one of the things that ends up happening is that without firm entry, you have a larger increase in the share of firms that end up adopting the technology, and that implies that then to reach the same reduction in emissions, you need a smaller carbon tax. So those are the two effects. I don't know which one is more relevant, or I don't remember which one is more relevant, but you have both effects, if that makes sense. This is just to say, how much weight we're putting on these results. I think it's more about understanding the role of an important adjustment margin that hasn't really been considered in the literature, which is, again, at least in the macro, climate change literature, this idea that, hey, you can actually adopt this new technologies that don't pollute as much, and then that has implications for how we think about carbon taxes. Now, in terms of the transitions, one interesting thing is that from a quantitative standpoint, in the short run, having a carbon tax.
Something.
Yes.
I have. In some sense, you told us that the effect of productivity due to the reduction in the stock of emission is not so large.
Correct.
Correct. Okay. So what this model is not about emission in some sense. That's the increase in productivity is only that you are cutting firms that are not good. So in some sense, you should, without any target of emission, a policymaker will do the same thing, so no, to put in taxes in the bad firms, or I'm wrong in something, because the increase in productivity is only because you're moving firms from a bad firm in terms of productivity to a good firm.
Sure. So yeah. So that's one component.
So
the other component
why the policymaker didn't do this thing before? Because carbon doesn't matter at all. Let us assume that we are 30 years ago, emission was not a problem. You should do exactly the same, no?
So yes, the sort of moving a little bit away from the model and thinking about why is it that you would want to do this. At least based on what we know, the damages from carbon emissions are bound to get worse. And that implies then that the way the damages function ends up affecting production is going to change, right? So it is true that you could think about forgetting about carbon emissions and thinking about carbon taxes. What you want to do is shift the economy from a low productivity environment to high productivity environment. That's something you can do in many different ways. Again, in the context of the model that this paper builds on, thinking about digital adoption. With digital adoption, you can become more productive, and then that's good for the economy. Our point is more about trying to understand to what extent, if you put a carbon tax on a given sector or a given set of sectors in this environment, to what extent are you actually having aggregate effects. But I take your point that this is more general than it's more about the composition of the economy, and we're just applying this to thinking about how a carbon tax is changing that productivity structure in the economy. I don't know if that answers your question. But so going back to your point about the damages function. So again, we take a baseline where the damages generated are roughly equivalent to 60.69% of GDP based on previous papers. But if we continue on the status quo, that's going to get worse over time, at least based on what people estimate. And that in turn makes it more relevant for you to think about a carbon tax, at least again, thinking outside of the context of the model.
Alan?
Yep.
Yeah. One question. This calibration probably it happens for advanced economies, but
yes, yeah.
But if you try to calibrate this for Brazil, only from the point of view for Brazilians, not considering that that burning the Amazon affect the rest of the world, it will still be from the point only considering Brazilians. It will still be better for them to implement something like a carbon tax.
So that's I'm currently working on basically thinking about this type of environment in an emerging country setting, for two reasons. First, one of the reasons we care about carbon taxes is because of their impact on unemployment. And then countries like Brazil have a very unique employment structure, informality and these types of things, where you do have to worry about what are the implications for basically how to think about what we call a just transition, where when you're introducing policies to deal with climate change, you're adversely affecting some households or some income groups more than others, right? So just to answer your question briefly, I don't know if applying this in the context of Brazil would end up delivering the same qualitative results, in the sense that you would see no adverse effects on output or employment. I think that very much depends on the structure of the economy, and I think there's a lot of work to be done thinking about emerging economies where you not only have you don't have good safety nets, you also, from a transfer standpoint, you have to think about how just very briefly in the context of Brazil, if you think about, for example, using the carbon tax as a transfer to households, one of the things that might happen at the margin, if you think about from a macro standpoint, is that you transfer resources to households. The household at the margin is going to potentially decide to say, hey, I might just create my micro enterprise with that money. So then you have adverse effects on productivity because now you might have more informality because of the transfers, right? So then that's where you have to really start to think about the distinct employment and firm structure that you have in emerging economies, and how these results don't necessarily need to carry through to an emerging market setting. But I think that's an open area of work.
I mean, I was also thinking if this kind of tax scheme can work country by country, or you need some kind of global transfer fund or something?
So you definitely need coordination, simply
Yeah.
because the US might be doing everything, but then if China doesn't do anything, then what's the point? And the other thing is, if developing countries don't start to think about dealing with climate change in a reasonable way, eventually developing and emerging economies are going to be responsible for the bulk of emissions given their development path. And so even if the U.S. starts to deal with climate change with a carbon tax, it's still unclear whether you're actually going to have an impact at the global level. Yeah, so those are things where you have to start to think about a multi-country setting to really get at the crux of this issue, for sure. So we see this paper as really thinking about a particular mechanism that is relevant, but then you have to think about in which context is this relevant or not. Again, in developing countries, it might be more difficult for firms to adopt green technologies, and the tax might be affecting the firms that are more productive because they're larger, right? So there are a lot
I
of
was thinking that
issues. Yeah.
maybe in developed country it could be even detrimental to the local economy, not only very little good, maybe it's bad, but it's
For
good
sure.
for the world as a whole, and then that will call for cross-country subsidies or something like that.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. So those are things that I think are very much open questions that I'm sure you at the central bank care about, and also we need models that capture the distinct structures of these economies to be able to say something quantitatively at least.
Alan, we have for the presentation 10 minutes left, and then another 8 minutes for a final discussion.
Absolutely, thank you. So in terms of the transitional dynamics, again, what I want to highlight is that you end up not necessarily seeing adverse effects in the short run either, partly because of the transition that happens with the adoption of these technologies. Now, given that, I want to leave a little bit more time for any other questions that I didn't have time to answer. But what I want to highlight is that, so one thing before move to the economic mechanisms, even though you have a reduction in the total number of firms, again, that puts a little bit of downward pressure on total output, but it doesn't really generate a sharp decline in output before you end up transitioning to a higher output steady state, and that I think is relevant to point out. Again, I'm not putting too much weight on the numbers here, but the fact that you don't see a sharp drop is I think important to point out. Now, in terms of the mechanisms, this is something that, again, whenever you see these results, it seems like, oh, this is too good to be true. Like, where is, as someone put it in a previous seminar, where is the magic happening? So in the baseline model, our firms have endogenously lower average productivity compared to G firms. And that's, again, partly because you have this fixed cost of adopting the green technology. But again, the average levels are endogenous, right? So that's important to point out. Now, what's happening when you think about a carbon tax when it comes to both the productivity profile in the two categories of firms and also on the marginal costs? There are two effects basically going in opposite directions. On the one hand, you have, when you introduce a carbon tax, what you're doing is you're pushing out of the set of existing firms, you're pushing more to adopt the green technology, and that reduces the average productivity level of those firms because you have more firms basically moving to that category. That also ends up reducing the average productivity of the firms that end up facing the carbon tax. This, in turn, ends up also putting upward pressure on the marginal costs across firms. So now the question is, and this is where again, this idea of technology adoption really comes in, is that the tax ends up shifting the production structure of the economy overall. How do we see this? You can think about total output as being comprised of different elements. One of them being the number of firms in the economy, where again, remember that this ends up falling with the carbon tax. And then the average output for individual firms in the regular sector and in the green sector. So think about Y tilde R as basically the average output of a regular firm, and Y tilde G as the average output of a green firm. Both of these at the individual level end up falling because of the carbon tax, and that has to do with the reduction in average idiosyncratic productivity in each category. What really ends up happening here is that you're shifting the weight that you put on average output for regular firms into basically the average output of green firms, i.e. the alpha Y ends up falling and the 1 minus alpha y ends up increasing. And that's what we mean by this endogenous production structure, right? That in a world where you don't have firm entry and technology adoption, the alpha y's are fixed. So the only thing that you're seeing is reductions in output in one firm that can or cannot be completely offset by increases in output by the other firm. How do we see this more clearly? This is basically looking at average idiosyncratic productivity for the two categories of firms. So again, for average productivity for a given firm, the average effective marginal costs, and then basically how the share of output, the way that you put on output for a set of firms versus the other changes. For the benchmark model, no firm entry, baseline, and then an exercise that is really going to highlight what's really happening here. So at the individual firm level, what you end up seeing is reductions in average productivity. But what you're seeing is a shift towards firms that are on average slightly more productive, although less so compared to the baseline. At the firm level, you also see an increase in marginal costs. But again, what's happening here is that if you take a look at the weighted average productivity for the whole economy, that's actually increasing because you're moving basically the way that you put on average productivity for regular firms into average productivity for green firms that are less productive relative to the baseline, but more productive relative to the regular firms. And you also see a reduction in the weighted average marginal cost. This becomes more apparent when you think about basically not allowing firms to enter or exit. You simply have the technology adoption margin where the gain in productivity is larger and the reduction in marginal cost is greater. And that explains again the changes in output that I showed you earlier in the steady state. When you think about a world that doesn't have firm entry or technology adoption, the productivity composition is not present, right? Because again, this alpha y is fixed. It doesn't respond to policy. But the change in the marginal cost is. So here with the policy, you end up increasing the weighted average marginal cost in the economy that ends up basically implying that overall production is going to fall. And in order to really highlight these mechanisms, we have this additional experiment where hypothetically, let's assume that we end up changing exogenously the average productivity of firms in each category to match what we see in the baseline model. So the negative 1.47 is the same here and here, and the same thing here, which implies that then, given that alpha y is fixed, the weighted average productivity of the economy ends up falling, the marginal cost ends up increasing, and therefore the fall in output is even larger. So this is really highlighting how this change in the composition of production of the economy, moving from a high carbon to a low carbon economy, is really having an impact on productivity that ends up explaining what happens to total output in the benchmark model relative to the other models. So this goes back to the previous comment about more broadly, this is, we're analyzing carbon taxes, but it really is about shifting the economy to a more productive state that allows you to offset the potentially adverse effects of the carbon tax on economic activity. In a way, this is almost like a Lucas critique type of argument, in the sense that in all of the models that we have had so far, the alpha y's have always been constant. And now we're saying, hey, the carbon tax can affect the underlying production structure of the economy. Let's take that into account. And it turns out that ends up basically offsetting some of the adverse effects of the tax on economic activity. So, yeah.
Sorry, a quick question.
Yeah.
So, looking at this table, I think I'm thinking whether there are the effects are linearly dependent on the level of carbon tax that you need to reduce the 35% in CO2 emissions or not. And my guess is that you have some space to improve, but at some point you have like a threshold above which you will not have more reallocation in terms of firms going from the dirty sector to the clean sector. So you will start seeing negative effects on the economy, right?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. One of the things that that would be reflected in effectively a point where the average productivity of green firms after the tax is very close to the average productivity of the regular firms after the tax, because all of the effects come from changes in the productivity profile of firms in response to the tax. So absolutely, eventually you're going to see a point where effectively this is either going to be very close to zero, or even potentially negative, depending on what happens to productivity. Yeah, for sure.
One very quick clarifying question. Yep. This fixed cost that you have to pay if you become a clean technology firm, yep. This is in terms of the consumption good?
Yes, exactly. So it's, you can express it in terms of output. You can make it a function of the marginal cost of firms. For now, again, in this setup, it's basically just a resource cost.
But you need to produce this in order to be able to.
Correct. Yes.
Where I'm going is that if you're thinking about developing economies, emerging economies that are buying these technologies from abroad, this doesn't go to the output that you're measuring here. So you might have a decrease.
It's almost like an investment, exactly. Yeah, you're investing in green technologies for sure. Yeah. So
how important is you have not mentioned the elasticity of substitution of goods, because if you have, let's assume you don't have elasticity of substitution, you cannot do that.
Yeah, so this is something that we take that parameter from what people have estimated for the US. So I think ours is calibrated to like, I think 3.8 or 4, so the epsilon here. I don't think we have this in the appendix of the paper, but the results don't really change if you go up to, let's say, like 6, which is another value that people end up assuming. The results would be pretty much the same. And in fact, if you allow for more substitution, things will get better. So at least the overall conclusions would not be sensitive. Yeah.
Across sector, I think that the elasticity of substitution is much lower than that. This is at the elasticity of substitution inside the same industry, no? 5, 6.
Yeah. So this is something we haven't tried with lower numbers, I guess. We could see what happens. I don't necessarily have an answer. Like if this were, let's say, like, I don't know, 2 or 3. I don't know I don't think this would change materially in the sense that you would still have either 0 or slightly positive effects, but you wouldn't get to a world where you have basically large negative effects, which is what we find. So I think the message here is not that we generally would think that you actually get truly positive effects, but as long as you're not generating damages at the aggregate level, I think that's something to point out, because most studies end up saying, hey, this is actually pretty bad from an output and consumption standpoint. But I take your point. I mean, this is just about sensitivity. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Alan?
Yes. Yeah. I'm actually almost done, so happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
No, go ahead. I'll ask later.
So again, we've tried with using the revenue from the tax to subsidize green technology adoption, subsidize firm creation, thinking about no abatement, and also changing some of the parameters that play a role when it comes to the labor market and emissions, and things don't really change materially. Just to conclude, and again, I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have. What we do is that we go back to thinking about the labor market and macro effects of thinking about a carbon tax in the US, with a model that importantly allows us to think about a margin that has been ignored in the literature, mainly the fact that firms can respond to policy not only by undertaking costly abatement of emissions, but also by simply switching the technology they end up using to produce from an emissions standpoint. And once we allow for this margin, it turns out that you don't necessarily see the negative effects on output consumption and income that you see in existing models. And the effects on the labor market are pretty limited. And this allows us to really rationalize, or offers a way to rationalize why is it that from an empirical standpoint for Europe in particular, why you might actually end up seeing small but positive effects of carbon taxes on employment and GDP. And I think, again, as I mentioned throughout the talk, there's a ton of work to be done when we think about this in the context of an emerging or developing country because of the barriers to technology adoption. because of the fact that often these technologies have to be imported, and also from a safety net standpoint, because you know, you might have unemployment benefits here in the U.S. that allow you to transition from mining to a different sector. That doesn't necessarily exist in many emerging economies. And then we have to think about how a just transition, using the terms, the terminology that, you know, that people use in this field, can take place in an emerging economy when safety nets are imperfect, and how does that transition end up affecting not only the labor market but also the aggregate economy. So let me stop there and you know, answer any other questions that you might have. And thank you again for all the questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Alan. It was a great presentation, and everyone for all your questions. We can stay here for about 10 minutes to keep going with questions. I wanna Yolanda Portilla, you asked me a question in the chat, so please go ahead and ask it.
Yeah, the main question here is, what is the social impact of your paper? I'm not clear about.
In the social impact in terms of what specifically do you have in mind? Just to make sure that I understand the question.
I don't know. It's about taxes. So yeah. What is the social welfare, for instance, here?
Okay, so that's one of the things that we're looking at aggregates, macro aggregates, and the labor market specifically. We don't want to say something specific about welfare, because at least, even though in the context of a model, you can take a look at what happens to welfare just by doing it in the standard way. There's a lot of issues related to the distributional effects of carbon taxes, and we think that that's a different paper, because you need to think about household heterogeneity and also ideas related to, for example, firm ownership. So within the context of our model, welfare would be greater because you have a reduction in emissions, you have this improvement in productivity, and you end up having greater consumption overall. Even though participation is also increasing, the increasing consumption dominates. So within the model, we would end up seeing greater welfare. But again, taking this to actually the real world, I think you need to take more seriously the issues of household heterogeneity and the potential distributional effects of a carbon tax, that some groups might be more affected than others in the context of a carbon tax.
Alan, I also have a question. I don't know if you guys have thought about the interaction with this carbon tax and another set of taxes in the economy.
So meaning in terms of using the carbon tax revenue to offset other taxes that you have in the economy, or?
Yeah, you could have a different optimal mix depending on the government target on deficit, which in the US there is not, right? But
yes, so I think a lot of the discussions about carbon taxes so far have actually been, if you take a look at countries like Norway and other Northern European countries, oftentimes what they end up doing is rebating the income from the tax revenue back to households. There is the Hafstad and Williams paper from 2018 ends up analyzing what happens if you use the carbon tax revenue to, let's say, lower payroll taxes, right? That at least in our world, if you were to do that, if you had payroll taxes, you would end up seeing greater positive effects, because you're making it easier for firms to hire. And that's going to boost not only economic activity by green firms, but it's also going to end up having these positive effects from a productivity standpoint as well. So from that perspective, I think if the way you use tax revenue is not necessarily affecting the main results, and you can think about alternative uses of that revenue from an optimal standpoint, right? But that would be more of a, I guess, Ramsey type of environment more than what we have here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Alan?
Yep.
Something, let's assume that we don't have this externality about emissions, stock of emission. Which is the coordination problem that there is in this before the tax on carbon? There should be an externality or something that is or a problem of coordination, because otherwise I cannot understand why, without these productivity gains from reducing emissions, why the economy doesn't arrive before to the good equilibrium, because the only problem of coordination or whatever is the search part of the model, no? Or because otherwise the model.
So there is an externality. So you have an externality in the labor market. We don't assume the Hosius condition. So in principle, there is an externality there. But there's the other externality is in the fact that when you think about what our firms are doing, they don't internalize the fact that whenever they produce, they end up having this effect on productivity. It is true that from a quantitative standpoint, this is small, but it's still an externality within the context of the model. Now, going back to your question, if you were to eliminate this and you were to introduce a carbon tax, I mean, that would have qualitatively the same effects. It's just that the changes will be quantitative, but it's unclear how you motivate a carbon tax. Yeah,
because this would be that there is an externality. That's the market is not solving, but without this D, you don't have any externality. So I don't understand much unless you're moving production from one sector to another, but you're not taking account the welfare of consumer, that you're imposing consumption in a good that they didn't like before. Because otherwise, I don't understand. Without this D, there is no any externality besides the labor market. But I don't think that's the searching model. But I don't think that your results are coming from there.
I mean, again, a lot of the results are coming from how you're switching the composition of production in the economy and the associated effects with productivity at the aggregate level, where again, productivity in this context is endogenous. So I think is your question, why is it that we're not moving to a world where we have higher productivity?
Yeah, before that, yeah, because
well, I mean, because
I think they're missing the demands, the household decision how much to consume of one good of the other.
But that's captured in the production. But so that's captured in the production function in the sense that you can have the CS aggregator, but instead of thinking about output, you can think about consumption of the two types of goods. It's exactly the same idea. You would still have endogenous changes in the shares of each of the goods that you end up consuming. So it doesn't really. You still have a notion of demand.
Can I ask the same question, but in a different way?
Yeah.
So if you don't have this externality, what would the planner choose? Would it?
So the thing is that we're not analyzing a planner scenario here. We're simply saying.
I know. But it's just to understand if any of these results are.
Yeah.
What fraction of the results are coming because of the externality, or if there is something else that we are not getting.
Right. So I don't think I can answer the question about the planner without actually solving the planner's problem. So from that perspective, again, we're saying what happens if you introduce a tax that will be consistent with a reduction in emissions, and what are the mechanisms that affect the aggregate effects? I think thinking more clear, and I think this is when you think about externalities, then again, you have to think about what the planner will do. I think that's a different paper. You really have to set up the Ramsey problem there and think about the optimal tax. I don't think I have an idea of what the optimal carbon tax would be here without computing it.
Alan?
Yeah.
Actually, you don't need the damage function in the model to get the same results, right? The only thing you need is the CO2, the target for the CO2 reduction, right? You want to reduce 35% of the CO2 emissions, so you have to find which is the carbon tax that allows you to get to that level of reduction, right? But the damage function is not playing an important role here if you are accounting the global emissions are not only the US CO2 emissions as the source for the damages.
So yes, I think when you really want to make quantitative statements, like truly in terms of actually believing the numbers that you're getting instead of looking comparatively across models, then the damages function does play a role. And that's when, again, if you start to think about the damages function being more and more relevant because climate change is getting worse, then I think that externality is going to play more of a role. So maybe going back to some of these comments, one way to maybe potentially test this is having the same model and calibrate the damages function to, instead of being close to what was it 1% of GDP, say that it's 5% of GDP, and see to what extent you end up getting those results. My sense is that the effects will be larger. The positive effects of a carbon tax will be larger the larger the damages are, because then that's when things start to really kick in when it comes to from a productivity standpoint in reducing production when you have more emissions. But again, that's something that you would have to test with the model. I think, one of the issues here is if you really want to do the planner's problem, which I think is something that eventually can be done, there are a lot of bells and whistles, right? Because we don't know. So there you have the search and matching frictions. So there's an externality there. Then you have to think about optimal taxation in a model with endogenous firm entry, which is something that, again, has been done, but without all of these bells and whistles. So you have different margins that you need to take into account more seriously before making a statement about the optimal tax. And at least I don't think I'm smart enough to be able to do it on the top of my head in terms of being able to say whether the tax that we obtain is the optimal tax or not.
Alan?
Yep.
Hey, Alan, Andres Fernandez here.
Yep.
Great to have you. I have a couple of questions. Maybe since we're beyond time, let me just roll them on the table and we can take them on the bilateral. Feel free to respond. So one is a point that I may have missed. You're not assuming any cost of reallocating labor from one sector to the other, are you? That's one relatively minor, I don't know, point. Yep. But the other one is more something that is outside of the model, but I think is crucial and you haven't touched upon. My little knowledge after starting to read about this not too long ago is really a problem of scalability in these green technologies. So can we realistically think that given the technology we have, these green technologies can be scaled to the full extent of firms in the economy? Mm-hmm. My understanding is that we're not there yet. So I'm wondering if within the model you can capture this through some kind of nonlinearity, where the experiment that you mentioned about using the carbon tax revenue and feeding it to R&D or any type of technology that would, or any type of way in which that would boost this green technology, might have a lot of extra bite, right?
So this is just when it comes to labor reallocation, the vacancies that you have to post if you're a green firm versus a regular firm are different. So in this sense, we're being very conservative when it comes to the reallocation, that if you want to move employment from one sector to the other, you actually have to search directly. So it's basically a full cost environment in the sense that it's not even that you simply move people from one firm to the next and it's not costly. You actually have to go through the transition of going through unemployment, and it's costly for both the firm and for the household. So in that sense, there are costs to reallocating labor. The other point about the scalability, I think that's an excellent it's an excellent question. The way you can deal with this in the context of our model is by making this fixed cost, that for now is just basically a number, making it increasing in the number of green firms that you have in the economy. So the more green firms you have, the costlier it becomes to actually add another firm to that sector. And I think that will capture this idea that if we give solar panels to everyone, who knows if that's actually even possible, right? From a electricity grid standpoint and all of these things that, again, I'm not an expert on. But from a reduced form standpoint, you could actually capture this cost as being increasing in the number of green firms. Quantitatively, what would end up happening is that you would have potentially a smaller increase in output, but an increase nonetheless. So these numbers would be smaller, but they wouldn't turn negative, even for high levels of convexity. And that has to do again with the productivity, with the endogenous productivity differences between firms.
Hey, Alan, my question is related to Andres' question.
Yeah.
Is since you're assuming like a constant technology of green capital, it would be more costly for the firms to adopt green technology since you have like less a limited amount of supply, and it goes exactly to the question of Andres. And the other thing is, how do you incorporate the fact that, I'm not going to say reliable, but it's like clean technology is more weather dependent.
Yeah.
So if you based on wind technology, a place, you're going to put it everywhere. Or solar has to be in a specific spot, and on the other hand, their technology just buy a truckload of coal and you can keep the machine running, basically.
Yeah. No. So I mean, those are excellent points, especially if you think about in Chile with hydroelectric power. If you end up seeing reductions in the amount of rainfall that you end up getting, and the depletion of rivers and all of these types of things that make these technologies less reliable, that's something that we don't consider in the model. One of the things that you could take into account is again, from a fixed cost standpoint, it might be the case, if you want to capture this in a reduced form way, it would basically be making the fixed cost of technology adoption a function of, let's say, the inputs that you end up using in that sector. Meaning instead of being a number, it's actually variable and it depends on the inputs that you use. My sense, and again, in a very reduced form way, I think that the issues that you're talking about are extremely important because we need reliable energy sources, right? Or reliable renewable energy sources. Within the context of the model, again, it would be playing around with the fixed cost that potentially this less than ideal reliability on renewable energies would potentially imply that the cost of adopting the technologies is higher for the firm, right? So we're playing around with the level of the cost. And then I'm sorry, what was the first point that you had mentioned?
The first question was related to the fact that you have a fixed technology regarding clean capital to produce.
Yes,
was basically related to Andres' question.
Yeah.
Basically, you don't assume like a market for developing and growing technology and growing number of firms that offer this technology.
So that's in the sense that we don't necessarily have a notion of sort of R&D that. So one way to think about this is you could make the fixed cost a function of a new, a different category of capital that then you need to invest in, right? So that would be a very simple way of capturing this notion of R&D in a way that's costly. So that's one element. The other element, and I think that's maybe perhaps something that you have in mind, is the reallocation. You have capital in the economy, and you can reallocate it across sectors. If you were to have costlier reallocation, what that would do is, I don't think it would end up changing the steady state results. It could potentially slow down the adjustment, the transition, right? So it could be the case that maybe output falls a little bit more. It's eventually going to converge to a higher level, but the transition might take a little bit longer. But those are the ways in which you can capture this without going full blown. Let's think about endogenous R&D in this environment. What's nice about this setup, though, is that since both the measure of green firms and the measure of total firms in the economy is endogenous, the way models with endogenous firm interpret oftentimes is the creation of firms as being another type of capital. Right? So by you creating more firms or by you creating more green firms, that's also a type of investment. That's not fully capturing how costly it is to go through R&D and develop new technologies, but it is capturing the notion of a costly adjustment process when it comes to switching how you produce overall. I don't know if that makes sense or if it's convincing, but those are the ways in which I would think about this in the context of the model.